Most business owners think institutions evaluate single mistakes, but institutions evaluate patterns. And this episode explains how repeated behavior becomes a signal that institutions rely on when deciding risk, trust, and personal liability. When I say institutions, I mean any system that has to decide whether to trust your business without knowing you personally. Banks, courts, investors, underwriters, or regulators. Different rules, but the same question. Does this business operate independently of the owner, or is the owner still the business? Most owners believe their decisions are judged one at a time. One contract, one payment, one exception, one shortcut. But institutions don't build decisions on moments. They build decisions on repetition. If something happens once, it might be considered noise. If it happens again, it becomes noticeable. If it keeps happening, it stops looking like it's accidental and starts looking intentional, even if nobody ever meant it that way. And once behavior repeats enough times that it becomes predictable, institutions begin treating it as part of how the business actually functions. And once something becomes part of how the business functions, it becomes part of how the risk is assigned. A pattern is what happens when behavior repeats often enough that it becomes the expected outcome. If money moves the same way every time, that becomes the expected path. If decisions always route through one person, that becomes the expected authority path. If obligations always end up backed by the same individual, that becomes the expected responsibility path. Institutions don't need you to say you're responsible. They need to see that responsibility consistently lands in the same place. And once behavior repeatedly points to one person, institutions begin connecting the result of that behavior to that person, not to the entity named on the paper. That's how responsibility gets assigned structurally, not emotionally, not morally, but operationally. Most owners believe responsibility begins when something goes wrong. But in reality, responsibility gets assigned long before anything goes wrong. It gets assigned when behavior stops being random and becomes reliable. And reliable doesn't mean correct. Reliable means repeatable. Institutions trust repeatable behavior more than documents because repeatable behavior predicts future outcomes better than stated intention or what's said on paper. Intent can change overnight. Patterns rarely change suddenly. If something happens once, institutions treat it as an event. If it happens over and over, they treat it as part of the operating system of that business. And when behavior keeps pointing back to the same individual, institutions begin treating outcomes as belonging to that individual, even if the paperwork suggests otherwise. Not because they're trying to punish anyone, because systems need stable explanations to determine risk. The risk has to land somewhere, and systems place risk wherever the behavior is consistently pointing. If a person consistently acts as the final decision maker, risk begins to follow that decision maker. If a person consistently intervenes when something fails, risk begins to follow that intervention pattern. If a person consistently absorbs financial pressure when something goes wrong, risk begins to follow that financial behavior. And once risk begins following behavior, paperwork alone can't redirect it. Paperwork can describe the intended structure, but behavior reveals the functional structure, and institutions rely on functional structure. Most owners think protection requires perfection, but it doesn't. Institutions don't expect flawless operations. They expect understandable operations. If business behavior is stable, meaning it happens in a predictable way over time, institutions can model risk around it. If behavior consistently changes, institutions assume instability and increase the risk assumptions. Predictability reduces uncertainty. Reduced uncertainty lowers institutional resistance. That's why stable structure matters more than ideal structure. If authority consistently operates inside the business, institutions recognize the separation. If authority repeatedly drifts back to the owner, institutions are going to recognize integration, even if the documents say otherwise. Institutions are not punitive and they don't punish mistakes. They respond to reliability. And reliable behavior builds institutional confidence. Unstable behavior increases institutional caution. Patterns don't form during lawsuits. They form during normal operations. Every payment decision, every contract execution, every authority override, every exception made for speed or convenience. Over time, this creates a baseline. Baseline means the normal way that the business operates when nothing is wrong. So when a crisis happens, institutions compare crisis behavior to the baseline behavior. If the crisis behavior matches the baseline behavior, they assume nothing changed structurally. But if the crisis behavior suddenly shifts, they assume crisis behavior is temporary, not structural, which means normal behavior or baseline behavior is what determines long-term classification, not the emergency behavior. Most people try to fix structure during a crisis. But institutions have already decided structure during the calm periods. Eventually, institutions stop observing and start expecting. Expectation means the system now predicts the future behavior based on past repetition. Once the systems begin making decisions based upon the assumption that behavior is going to continue, they stop reevaluating from scratch every time. They begin building risk models around the expectation. Expectation becomes classification. And the classification determines who gets trusted, who gets questioned, who absorbs consequence first. And once classification is established, reversing it requires sustained new behavior, not explanations, because systems rely on patterns that proved reliable in the past. Late correction means behavior changes after classification already exists. At that point, institutions assume correction may be temporary unless it stays consistent for a long period. Systems continue moving based on prior classification because changing classification introduces new risk. Changing classification requires proof that the new behavior is not temporary, that it's not reactive or situational. And that requires time. Time under observation, time under pressure, time without fallback to the old patterns. Until then, systems rely on what already proved predictable. Because predictability reduces institutional uncertainty. And institutions are designed to reduce uncertainty first and evaluate fairness second. Institutions don't see moments. They see patterns. And patterns determine how risk flows, how responsibility is assigned, and whether a business is treated as separate from the owner or functionally tied to the owner. Behavior leaves patterns. Patterns create expectations, and expectations create classification. Classification determines liability, not because institutions are trying to be harsh, but because systems must decide where risk lives before the risk arrives. So most owners believe liability starts when something breaks, but in reality, liability is often recognized long before that. Quietly, gradually, through repetition. That's what institutions see that most business owners don't. Thank you for joining the Prosapreneur Network.